Welcome everyone to another episode of Practical SQL Server HA show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento and welcome. This whole show is dedicated to providing you tips, tricks, insights, sometimes blunders and mistakes to make sure that you are uh, not just implementing but also maintaining, managing your high availability solutions in a practical way. Because for one, high availability solutions and disaster recovery solutions, for that matter, are already very expensive. You don't want to be wasting. I don't want to say wasting, but you don't want to be spending more than what's necessary. I mean, when you talk about implementation, you got your hardware, you got your software, you got your consultant fees, you got support contracts, and all. It's already expensive. So make sure that you're not spending more than what is necessary. And I kind of look at it as insurance policy. I'm only going to pay the minimum premium required for me to be covered, nothing more, right? Because my goal is not to pay insurance premiums. My goal is to be healthy. In the business sense, the goal is to not implement HADR solutions and pay Microsoft or any of the service providers top dollars. The goal of every business is to grow the business, right? This topic keeps coming up in every conversation that I have with my clients, consulting clients, and customers, which is interesting because I maybe it's just me, and sometimes it gets so annoying when people would say, "Hey, we want to do automatic failover between data centers," and a typical scenario, customer would bring me in. Either I design a high availability / disaster recovery solution for SQL Server databases, so they're looking at a combination of failover clustered instances with log shipping or database mirroring. Yes, it's still supported. Deprecated doesn't mean unsupported. Failover clustering with availability groups. And a common question that I hear based on requests is, we want to do automatic failover between data centers. What for? And I just like asking questions because I really want to know exactly what the reason behind why they want something like that. And when they do, they start looking at other options. So they're building their database infrastructure. They're building their VMs if they're running on VMs with DR, NHA, and all of that. And then I started asking questions. What else? Because here's the thing: there's no point in having a highly available database system when apps can't connect to it. And I'm going to talk about some of the things that are that should be a part of your HADR design that go beyond database. Yep, there goes the title. That go beyond a database. Because again, the example that I typically use is when you're buying something off of Amazon, and all of a sudden, when you click that pay now or add to cart and then something goes wrong, you don't say, oh, there's something wrong with the database, or there's something wrong with the middle tier, or there's something wrong with the network. You don't. Even if you work for Amazon.com, even if you're the database engineer responsible for all of these things, you don't say there's something wrong with the database. No, you just say it's offline or it doesn't work, right? Perception is key. And when I'm the end user trying to use your system, I don't go about complaining that your database is slow or your network is down or your app couldn't connect. No, I just see it as everything's down. And that's why I want to cover three things that you have to consider beyond the database. Because again, the assumption is you already have a highly available database infrastructure, SQL Server, whether you're using failover clustered instances or availability groups. You gotta consider these three things. Grab your pen and paper. Make sure I'm looking for something that I could. Well, I'll just use my notes, digital notes. That is. First one is your apps. Your apps. I did say earlier, when you're buying something off of Amazon and then all of a sudden the button doesn't work, you don't say, oh, the web front end or the UI doesn't work. You just say, ew, it doesn't work. Even if the problem has something to do with the network, you don't go ahead and say, oh, there's the traffic between the web front end and the backend database isn't. You don't say that. You simply say it's offline. And it doesn't matter if you built a highly available, highly resilient, stable database infrastructure. I'll just use availability groups as an example. It doesn't matter if you have tested automatic failover between availability group replicas. It doesn't matter if you have done it so many times and you know for a fact that with your eyes closed, something goes wrong, the cluster does everything for you. If the application is not designed to take advantage of that, it's useless. And I've seen this happen in some of my the projects that I've worked with in the past, where the application still connects to the SQL Server instance rather than the availability group listener. And when I ask, well, why is that? Well, the application does not support connecting to the listener. I mean, it's just a listener name. It's a network name. It's no different from connecting to a network object or a DNS name. But they said the application does not support it yet. And it's also, again, it's one of the reasons why you got to be on the same page with everybody on the team, including your vendors. I remember working on a project a couple of years ago where the client wants to upgrade their database infrastructure, and part of the upgrade is also setting up high availability. So they were asking me about database mirroring back when database mirroring was still a thing. It still is. And the first question I asked them was, well, does your vendor support database mirroring? Because there's no point in implementing a high availability solution if your application does not support it. And you can complain about it all you want. You could raise or open a support ticket all you want. But if a certain configuration, a certain HA configuration is not officially supported by your app vendor, you're on your own. And that's the risky part of that. Because when something goes wrong, like I said in the beginning, when an entire website is down, you don't say, oh, it's the app's problem, or it's not. No, everything is down, and customers start calling you to complain, right? And that's why it is very important for you to ask the application developers, if you're building an in-house app or you're outsourcing your app to a third-party vendor, meaning there's an ISV or an independent software vendor that you're using for your apps. They have to support whatever HA and DR that you're providing, even before you build your AG, even before you build your failover clustered instances, even before you provide something that would make your databases highly available. Ask the app developers, will you support this? Because there's no point in going through the exercise of designing, implementing, deploying a high availability and or disaster recovery solution if the app does not support it, right? And sometimes support is just a matter of who can we blame. Sometimes technically it really is just a network name that is a simple DNS record that the application can use, but because they officially don't support it, even though you know for a fact it works, it's not about whether it works or not, because we can't agree on the fact that it will work, but the application vendor says we don't support it, you're on your own. Okay, so even before you start looking at deploying or designing a high availability and or disaster recovery solution for your SQL Server databases, ask. And again, especially with in-house developed apps, you have to start educating your application developers. And this is very challenging because, for one, the goal of every app developer, I used to be one, was to release features yesterday. So the sooner they can deploy code to production, the better. That's their goal. They don't care about HA. They don't care about security. They don't care about. That's one of the reasons why I started emphasizing on the SPA or the SPA, security, performance, and availability for developers, because that is something that they have to bake into their app. It's not like, yeah, we just connect to the database and that's it. No, how will the app behave if something goes wrong? And are they designing the app in such a way that it can be highly available, right? So that's the first one. Your apps, whether it's a third party, um, vendor, an ISV, or in-house developed app, you got to make sure that they do support it. And within your organization, if it's an in-house developed app, talk to your developers. Get them familiar, make them aware of the fact that they can implement high availability because the databases will be highly available, right? Even before you take that very first step in deploying a high availability or disaster recovery solution, make sure you're on the same page. Okay, that's the first one. The second one is the middle tier. And when I was starting out, I didn't really understand what this is. Like middle tier, what's the middle tier? It's the layer that connects the app to the back end, and that could be anything. It could be distributed transaction coordinator if you're running on a Microsoft platform. It could be an API that the applications are connecting to, that the API is now the one that's kind of like a data access layer to the database, so that everything is surfaced through an API. It could be another third-party vendor that acts as a middle tier. Same thing. Are those highly available? It's interesting because one of the goals for having APIs is to abstract access to the data layer. That's one of the goals. And programmatic, without giving them or developers or apps direct access to the data source. That's one of the main goals. So you now surface your data through an API and let the apps, let other APIs and services access the data access API. The question that you need to ask is, how highly available is this API? How resilient is their API? Because now if the database is resilient, it's highly available, but now you're surfacing this. So now there's an abstraction layer that would cause issues with performance. That's a huge deal because most of the time we're testing when it comes to accessing APIs in tens and 20s, less than 100 client applications connecting to the API. But what about when you're now serving thousands of customers or client access through the API? How's performance like? Because performance affects availability. I was just testing a script the other day on how I can increase CPU utilization for an availability group replica, just so I can test the behavior of how the replica would behave. And I'm just talking about the database side here. What about your middle tier? The minute that your client applications increase, right? There's an increase in client applications accessing the API. How is performance going to be? And when performance halts, doesn't matter if you have a highly available database, anybody using the API stops. They stall. They just wait, right? And waiting, as far as some people are concerned, as far as availability is concerned, if I can access the app in 2 seconds and now it's taking me 2 minutes, it's technically offline. And like I mentioned in the beginning, it's a perception thing. So how are your middle tier? How are they designed? Or are they even designed with high availability and or disaster recovery in mind? Okay. Performance is one thing. Scalability is one thing. How do you scale? Because these are things that you have to factor in. And again, it doesn't matter if your database can automatically fail over. In the case of like the testing that I was doing the other day, high CPU utilization, SQL Server detected that, failed over the AG. Doesn't matter if your database can do that. But if the middle tier could not, well, you're toast, right? So the middle tier, that's one thing that you have to keep in mind. And as we're bringing all of these together, the number 3 thing is the network. And I'm not just talking about redundancy in your network. That should be a given. I've seen cases where, and again, whether it's physical machines or virtual machines, I've seen cases where even in physical machines, they got multiple network adapters, they got multiple nodes in a failover cluster, multiple replicas in an AG, but they're all plugged into the same network switch. They're all plugged in to the same net. And this is something that I've learned when I was still working as a data center engineer, because part of our regular testing DR exercise is to fail over all of our apps, middle tiers, database servers, everything onto our DR data center. Well and good, we're happy to a point where we're automating all of these things until our senior network guy started asking question, hey, wait a second, I'm not doing anything. And it's not that he does not like the idea of not doing anything. Of course, I'd like to get paid without doing anything. But the fact is, he's not doing anything means there must be something missing. Because while the app developers were failing over the apps, middle tier guys were failing over the middle tier, we, the database people, were failing over everything. He was sitting there asking the question, wait, the network is working. We're not testing resiliency of our networks. Nobody was unplugging the switches. Nobody was rebooting them. Nobody was unplugging network. Nobody was doing that. And so he identified a gap in our disaster recovery exercise. He identified a gap in even in our high availability exercise, because now there's no point in your availability groups or fail of clustered instances failing over automatically when your network becomes a single point of failure, right? Even so, when your applications are involved, like I said, your apps need to also be highly available. How are you implementing high availability for your apps? Are they being are the workload client connection, are they getting redistributed across the app using a load balancer? Is the load balancer highly available? And all of these things come back to that very basic question: is how highly available is the entire stack? Because sure, again, you could provide high availability to your databases. Sure, you designed your apps and your middle tiers to have uh, redundancy, where the workload, you can spin up a new server or a VM if in case you need to scale out the workload. But how are they all connected? And again, this is something that's very easy to overlook, especially in today's age of software defined networking. We kind of assume, sure, software defined networking, everything's well taken care of, but how will your app, your middle tier, your databases behave if something goes wrong with the network? And this is one of those reasons why I always emphasize that high availability in disaster recovery is not an individual sport. It's a team sport. And you got to ask these questions to, again, your app developers, whether they're in-house or a third party. You got to ask your middle tier people, whether that's, again, a third party or in-house developed, and your network people, how resilient are our entire infrastructure when something like this goes wrong? Because again, we're only looking at it from one piece, whether it's the database. Sure, databases are highly available, but what about the app, right? I was talking to one of my clients, because I'm working on another project at the moment, where the DBA was explaining how, in addition to having availability groups that span across data centers in different countries, right? In addition to that, they have a replication configured for a few of their databases that go to a totally different data center. And he was saying, well, I don't even see the point of having the replication going on if the client application does not support it. And I don't even see the point of having configured this with the app if it doesn't support, or the middle tier or the APIs do not support getting redirected in case something goes wrong with the client application. I don't even see the point of configuring replication when nobody's connecting to it, because neither the middle tier nor the app support it. And there's no point in having an available group listener if your application and your middle tier don't support connecting. It all ties together, right? It all ties together. And that's why I said this is a team sport. You got to ask the questions beyond your database is being highly available. You got to ask app developers, middle tier developers, network people, infrastructure people, even. right? Infrastructure people even. Last episode, I talked about the new VMware. If you're deciding, hey, I don't want to do VMware anymore, I want to go back to physical machines because in the long run, it's cheaper. So how are you going to be able to provide resiliency and high availability once you switch back from VMs to physical or from a VMs to the cloud? How are you going to provide resiliency and high availability for the entire stack, right? Not just one component in the stack, but everything. Because perception for end users is reality. And I like using the example of the Amazon purchase because everybody's familiar, well, almost everybody, everybody's familiar of making purchases off of Amazon.com, where if something goes wrong, even if you're a CCIE or a database expert, you don't go around and say, "Oh, I cannot add to cart. It's a network problem or it's a routing." No, you don't. You just say it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, um, it is technically offline. So you got to make sure that every pieces work together to make sure they're all highly available and highly resilient. All right, that is about it for this episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. And again, it's interesting because people would come to me, my customers would come to me, my clients would come to me thinking, oh yeah, we need to have our databases highly available, without thinking about all of these things. And all of these things lead to whether or not your databases become accessible. Okay, because what's the point of having a highly available database if it's inaccessible because your app, your middle tier, your network do not support connecting to a highly available database, right? Again, that is about it for this episode of Practical. I did say it's practical and actionable. Action item, call to action. Talk to your developers. How resilient and how highly available are the apps? Are they designed with HA and DR in mind? Go ask your middle tier or even your vendors. How are they? Do they support your high availability and disaster recovery solution? Or even if you're still planning on deploying a high availability and disaster recovery solution, ask your developers, ask your vendors, ask your network guys, ask your infrastructure team. Will they support whatever it is that you're going to deploy? And I don't mean support. I just mean, hey, will the app support connecting to the listener name? Or will the middle tier support scaling out and still connect to the database? Or is your network highly resilient and highly available? Start the conversation as early as now. You don't want to be caught into this trap of, hey, my databases are highly available, but nobody can connect to it, because none of those three things were designed with HA and DR in mind, right? And if you need any help with your high availability infrastructure, maybe you need a second pair of eyes to look at your infrastructure, maybe do a quick assessment of your failover clustered instances, availability groups, your failover clustered environments, or you need your staff to be ready to support your existing SQL Server HA and DR solutions, reach out. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. By the way, this will lead you to my calendar page where you can pick and choose a time that works for you. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and let's have that conversation where we can come up with a strategy on how to achieve your high availability and disaster recovery goals. All right. That is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA and DR show. Goodbye.